I never imagined my own daughter would lock me out of the house her mother and I spent 34 years building together. One ordinary Tuesday morning, a single phone call changed everything. Ashley, my only child, calmly informed me that she and her fiancé, Trevor, had changed the locks on my home. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Then I discovered something far worse. The people I loved most weren't looking at me as a father anymore. They were looking at me as an asset. What they didn't know was that years earlier, after my wife Linda passed away, I had quietly put protections in place that would change everything. And before this story was over, secrets would be exposed, relationships would shatter, and the truth about Trevor's plans would leave everyone stunned. This is the story of how my daughter tried to take my home, and how one mistake brought their entire plan crashing down. The day my daughter changed the locks on my own house, I was standing in a grocery store comparing two brands of coffee. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September, the kind of morning that feels peaceful without you even noticing it. The air was cool, the sky was clear. Retirement had taught me to enjoy simple things, and choosing coffee had somehow become one of them. My phone buzzed. Ashley. I smiled automatically before answering. Hey, sweetheart. Her voice sounded rushed. Dad, are you busy? Just shopping. What's going on? There was a brief pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. Trevor and I had the locks changed today. For a second, I thought I'd heard her wrong. The locks on what? The house. I stood motionless in the middle of the aisle. My house? It's not like that, Dad. Whenever someone says it's not like that, it usually is. I pushed my cart aside and walked toward the front of the store. What exactly do you mean, Ashley? Another pause. We thought it would be easier if we handled some things now instead of later. I stopped walking. Later. That word stayed with me. What things? The property, the future, planning ahead. I could hear Trevor speaking somewhere in the background, not loudly, just enough. Enough to know he was listening. Enough to know this wasn't an accident. I ended the call 10 minutes later feeling older than I had that morning. The drive home felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed to last forever. Every mile gave me more time to think. The house appeared exactly the same when I turned into the driveway. The flower beds were neat. The grass was freshly cut. Linda's roses were still blooming along the porch. Nothing looked different. Everything was different. I walked to the front door and reached into my pocket. The key slid into the lock, then stopped. I tried again. Nothing. The lock had been changed. I stood there staring at the doorknob. 34 years. 34 years of mortgage payments. 34 years of birthdays, holidays, family dinners, and memories. And suddenly my key no longer worked. The front door opened. Ashley stepped outside. Behind her stood Trevor. He folded his arms. Ashley looked nervous. Dad, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stared at her. Harder than what? She glanced toward Trevor before answering. We've been talking to financial advisors. Of course they had. Everything with Trevor eventually came back to money. Every conversation, every decision, every relationship. I looked past them into my own living room. Linda's photographs still sat on the mantel. The same photographs I'd dusted every Saturday for 8 years after she passed away. Yet somehow I felt like a stranger looking through someone else's window. Give me one good reason, I said quietly, why I shouldn't call the police right now. Trevor stepped forward. For the first time all afternoon, he smiled, not a warm smile, a confident one. The paperwork is more complicated than you think, Robert. Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Paperwork. Complicated. Those weren't words people used unless they believed they had an advantage. Ashley looked down at the ground. She couldn't meet my eyes. And that hurt more than anything Trevor could have said. Because in that moment I realized something terrible. This conversation had started long before today. Plans had been made. Decisions had been discussed. And somehow I had become the last person to know. I left without arguing. Not because I agreed. Because I was too shocked to think clearly. For 20 minutes I drove aimlessly through town. Past the park where Ashley learned to ride her bicycle. Past the ice cream shop where Linda used to take her every Friday after school. Past the church where we buried Linda 8 years earlier. Every place held a memory. Every memory felt heavier than the last. Eventually, I parked beside the river and sat there watching the water move. The phone remained silent. No apology. No explanation. Nothing. That evening, I checked into a small motel on the edge of town. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and cleaning chemicals. The television sat mounted on the wall. The bed creaked whenever I moved. I hadn't stayed in a motel alone in decades. Not since before I married Linda. The loneliness felt different now. Sharper. Around 9 o'clock, my phone finally buzzed. A text from Ashley. "Dad, please try to understand. We're only trying to protect the family's future." I stared at the message. Then I looked around the tiny motel room. The family. Interesting choice of words. Apparently, I was no longer included in it. The next morning, I called Frank Delaney. Frank answered on the second ring. "Robert, I need help." Something in my voice must have alarmed him. "Office, 10 o'clock. Frank listened quietly while I explained everything. The changed locks, the conversations, the pressure, the growing obsession with my property. When I finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "I'm surprised it took this long." I frowned. "What does that mean?" Frank opened a drawer and removed a folder. A thick one. My name sat on the front. "Because 6 months ago somebody tried to obtain information about your estate." The room suddenly felt colder. "Who?" Frank looked directly at me. "Trevor." I sat speechless. Frank continued. "He couldn't get anything. Legally, I couldn't tell him anything, but he asked." My stomach tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because at the time I wasn't sure it mattered. Now it mattered. A lot." Frank opened the folder. "Years earlier, after Linda died, I'd established a protected family trust. Very few people knew about it. The trust controlled most of my assets. Not immediately, not dramatically, but enough to prevent exactly the kind of situation I was facing now." Frank tapped the paperwork. "The house isn't the asset they think it is." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He smiled slightly. "Technically, Robert, you don't fully own the house anymore." I blinked. "What?" "The trust does." For the first time in days, I felt something resembling relief. Ashley and Trevor thought they were taking control. In reality, they were trying to seize something that legally couldn't be transferred without several layers of approval. Frank leaned back. "Which means they're about to learn an expensive lesson." I wish I could say that made me happy. It didn't. Because no matter what Trevor had done, Ashley was still my daughter. The little girl who used to sleep on my chest during thunderstorms. The little girl who cried for 2 days when her goldfish died. The little girl Linda adored more than anything in this world. And somehow that little girl had grown into someone I barely recognized. Frank must have sensed what I was thinking. "You still want to save her." I didn't answer, because he was right. Part of me still believed there was a way back. Part of me still hoped this wasn't really Ashley. Part of me still wanted my daughter back. But deep down, another part of me knew something difficult. Sometimes people don't become different overnight. Sometimes they slowly reveal who they've been becoming all along. And the hardest thing a parent can do is finally accept it. 3 days later, everything exploded. Because Trevor made a mistake. A very big mistake. And that mistake would change the entire story.